world's authorities on agri-food studies, and Terry has spent his entire career developing a sustainable paradigm of agri-food studies, and he's mentored many, many people here over the years. So Terry will kick us off, and then we'll move to Adrian, yeah, and then we'll move to Rian, and then we'll open up for discussion about sustainable food systems and what it means to us here in Wales, not just within the academy, but in the worlds of policy and practice as well. So, will you please join me and welcome our three speakers this evening.
Over to you. Thank you very much, Terry. That's very embarrassing. It's really great to see Adrian here, who I haven't seen for 18 months. So the last 6 months of this book was written and finished via electronic means, and it was great. A great partnership, actually. This is supposed to be a celebration, but very informal. It's not a formal lecture of any sort. So it's good to reflect on this project, but also how it relates to other projects. The first thing I wanted to say was a little bit of history about all this, because I think it's instructive, and well, hopefully we learn from our experiences about how to collectively energise and keep our research going and make it relevant for policy and practice. And that's something central to city regional planning and geography here, and RAS and place. And it should be said, the first thing to say is that, as Kevin rightly said, that in 1995, nearly 20 years ago, I was invited to come here as Professor of Environment Policy, and with a very enthusiastic and very supportive head of school, Jeremy Alden. And if it hadn't been for him, at that point we had a half-time professor, one lecturer, one PhD student, working on the environment, right? And since then, it's been just such a great experience, okay, one way and another, in terms of helping to build collective efforts and a PhD cohort, but also postdocs and staff in the environment, and particularly in the food area. And since then, we've moved on and we created with Ken Petey and his support RAS, which was an ESRC centre for 11 years, and developed the food work and spread it out embryonically, flexibly. And I thank Ken for his support in terms of developing this work through the late 90s and into the first decade or more of the 2000s. So here we are, and you know, I think it is important to say, as Kevin mentioned, that we are in a place, and many of the debates have been held in this building and in this room, and we continue to keep wanting to do that. A place where food studies and nature and space and environment are a major area of building and capacity. And we are now in a position. Some people call us the Cardiff School internationally. Some people call us the Cardiff Mafia. Some of this has been serendipity, but also there's been a lot of effort and a hell of a lot of commitment to the field. And the other thing that's gone on, which I think is important in this, are two things. One is the linkages we've had actively with the, as I say in the preface to this book, the linkages we've had with practice in all sorts of ways, and policy. And that the research that we do in this field is informed and interchange with practice and policy. That's why it's important to see all of you here, and Rian's here, represent some of that practice and policy this evening. And the other important point is that, interestingly, as we've gone on, we've attracted other staff, academic staff and faculty, to the question about food, such that we've also been labelled the foodies, you know. And that's interesting, because what's happened is that people, Kevin's included actually, and someone who's been extremely productive in other areas of the economy, regional development, innovation studies, was enthusiastic about food back in the early 2000s. And that's an interesting and very healthy development about how we should knock down boundaries and create synergies between things. And the food research, I think, that we've done, particularly at Cardiff, is one which, as this book hopefully reflects, looks out rather than inwards in terms of that sector. It's not just about food as a commodity or as a particular thing you eat. It's also about how it links to environment, nature, regional economic development, Wales, and so on. And during that period, of course, I don't need to tell this audience that clearly the significance, policy significance of food itself has become more and more important. So I'm going to let the speaker, the authors that are in the room at some point later, to say what they want about their own chapters here. But to say this book is a tip of an iceberg, therefore, because we've published many books and we've published lots of articles across the school and the institute and the centre around food over the last decade or more. And this book arose out of a conference that Adrian organised a few years, 2011 was it, where, on saying, well, let's try and put together some summation of what we at Cardiff, in Brass particularly, have been arguing and what the research shows. So we tried to showcase the research in the conference 2011, and then, of course, the conference went very well, but then there's a sort of pause, and then we said, well, let's really try and produce a book out of this. And so what we produced here was a rather unique book these days, which is a book which is made up. All of these people have got, for one reason or another, sort of Cardiff birthrights, even if they're not all here anymore. They were passed through, or were part of the project in one way or another. And so we thought we would produce it. You know, in some respects, it's not always easy to get a publisher to publish a thing that may look a bit inward-looking. Oh, this is the Cardiff Mafia again, you know. But we did, and we did it because the papers, the chapters in this book are of international quality. And the approach which we adopted, not just the content, was one of being synoptic and providing a synthesis of particular areas, as well as synthesizing a lot of research that's gone on in these different fields. So what we do with the book, and I'll let Adrian talk a little bit more about the overall framework, sustainable food paradigm. That's a big term. That's that's quite a statement to make. Paradigm is a big word to use. It shouldn't be used lightly. But we see it in a flexible, inclusive sort of way. But then, particularly given, as we had that conference during that period of food price hikes, and then the financial and fiscal crisis and so on that also ensued, what we thought it was important was to reflect on the last decade's work. So it's not just, it is partly a retrospect. So we asked colleagues to also think about and reflect on the work that they were doing and have done in these other projects. And you know, when you're working on a, as we all know, whichever field it is, you're working on a project by project basis. You know, your life becomes some sort of plan of work packages. And this was an opportunity to get people to think about how to reflect on all of that. And so what these chapters represent are synoptic accounts and synthetic accounts of the ways in which various projects, and a whole accumulation of different projects, some of them funded by policy agencies like the EU and I'm pleased to say the Welsh Government in many cases, but also the ESRC and research councils, projects that were going on, then asking authors to creatively build a synthesis of what they'd learned and where this was going. So we were trying to be both retrospective and prospective in these chapters. That was the objective. And I'm pleased to say, I think it was a pleasure generally to try and put this together, and it worked pretty well. The themes are not necessarily exhaustive of the paradigm at all, necessarily, but they are significant areas where we've worked and will continue to work. I'll come on to my third point about future in a minute, which are relevant. Now, I'm going to concentrate a little bit on some of the chapters where the authors are not here. Sorry. The third chapter, governance is a major theme, or the relationship between governance, civil society, and the economy is a major framing of what we are trying to do here. In RAS, we spent 10 years or more looking at food, the changing nature of food governance, and Bob Lee here synthesizes a lot of this work around, for instance, I think it's quite unique in many respects, the real significance of liberalisation of markets and the philosophy of liberalisation, often people call neoliberalism, or trade, and the significance of trade, how it inflects itself in policy at European level and at the UK level. And so his essay is very much about the way in which when crises happen and when policies are formed, one of the key aspects of all this, which I think often gets forgotten, is trade relations and the need, particularly with the European project and the internal market, about how to maintain and enhance trade in food. I think that's a really interesting question, because in many respects we have to question what sort of trade and mobility we want about food, actually, because a lot of the problems, diseases, issues to do with equality, as we saw with horse meat and so on, diseases and so on, reflect this problem of trade itself. So liberalisation of trade and how it confronts questions of food security and biosecurity are a key critical dynamic of the food sector. And as an environmental lawyer, what Bob does is take us through the Brindline processes which affect that issue. So that's one example. We then move on to, again, the tip of the iceberg is the best way to describe it, an enormous amount of work that's been done by others, but also particularly by Kevin and Adrian, who started the whole work on procurement as a problematic in the food system, and the role of the state and the public realm in food. And that despite the ideology of neoliberalism and free markets, the state, of course, plays a critical role in the management of food and the management of food consumption, and therefore the construction of markets. So you have this sort of tension here between what should the state do, how should it be defined, what should it contract. And as a spender of a large amount of public funding for food, that's an important area. And in fact, unique, the first people to work on this area. And one of the things that we, perhaps with hindsight now recognise, is that a lot of these authors were the first people to start dealing with these sorts of issues. And that's also reflected in Gareth's. Is Gareth here? Okay, we talked about Gareth then. Well, Gareth's work on biosecurity, particularly around the badger issue, which is clearly still topical. But also Mara's and John's paper, a chapter on welfare, animal welfare. But, you know, the first big project that developed a social science, but interdisciplinary understanding of the differences in Europe in the way in which bioeconomy and sustainability issues were being regulated around these issues, and the relationship between the state and civil society and markets. And interestingly, in that chapter, you know, they have this continuum of market-based forms of regulation versus more territory-based forms of regulation, and then, of course, the Scandinavian model, which is interesting. So, An interesting tension in all this is, questions of commonality of purpose around food, common principles in sustainability paradigm, but also how do you deal, whether it's state or the market, with spatial uneven development and the questions of space. How do you deal with it? That people want to do things differently in different places, and they have different customs about animal welfare and about the practices of slaughtering and dealing with consuming these sorts of projects. And that comes out in Mara's and John's paper. They are here, so I won't say any more about that. Then the way in which this book was sort of organised also was that as we move through some of these more generic themes, we sort of concentrated, because this is what we sort of do, and I think it is an important intervention here at this current moment, and that is we're interested in space and place. Okay, so we're not just economists. A lot of economists now are rushing into food security as an issue, because they say, food security is a grand challenge. Let's rush into it and let's work out the economic models between producer prices and consumer prices. And what they're finding is there's no linkage at all. And they're saying, why isn't there no linkage at all? Because space and nature and food intervene. Because we're not modelers, and we don't necessarily, as consumers or producers, act in ways which would suggest that the price mechanism is the only mechanism that operates here. We knew that in the 50s and 60s. That's why we intervened in the first place. You have to decouple production and consumption from market forces. And so, what we see here, I think, is the significance of space re-emerging as spaces and places of possibility. The place becomes a stage, the Gotham stage in the theoretical sense, upon which we react and reorganize the relationships we want around production and consumption and the processing of food. And we see this in rural-urban interconnections, but they're not what they were. They're not the established principles about how we organize rural and urban places. In Alex and Selleck's paper comes out how we deal with that and how actually farmers and farmers' organisations deal with the new urban demands for rural goods and services. And then also, and these people who are not here, colleagues Roberta and Jessica, on one area of spaces of possibilities is the growth in alternative food movements, urban strategies for food security and sustainability. And Kevin's been more involved than I have in this, but what we see there, of course, is a growth of new forms of political engagement and social organisation, institutional development in urban food strategies across the UK, but also internationally, making a statement about the integration, the need for more integration of food policy. So we go from something that was central to something that is now re-problematizing place and space in the volume. And then the conclusions, you might find some of the conclusions rather depressing, but, in a sense. But the point about the conclusions is that we are where we are. So let me go to the future. Say a couple of words about what we were trying to do in the conclusions here. Is that clearly since 2007-8, when we first started working on this in the late 90s and early 2000s, we were interested in alternatives. We were interested in alternatives because there were alternatives. And these things were growing and developing. Organic foods, quality food chain, new forms of certification around food, what's it, revalorization of the use of rural land, potential to revalue farming and production, to reconnect with more healthier consumption. Yeah, that's fine. Still there. Still very important. But we know that since 2007-8, we've got a wider agenda here. Climate change, fiscal problems in many states, food poverty, food security as being as a construction, basically. That food poverty has become partly a major element of economic deprivation and social deprivation in the UK and advanced economies. Problems of obesity and malnutrition, undernutrition, and so on. So what we find is, after all of this work, is that, well, we thought the agenda was pretty big in the late 90s. Look at it now, you know, it's got bigger and more embedded. And therefore we need to have, or to rethink theoretically and practically, how we broaden these themes such that we deal with a wider set of ecological, social, health and economic issues. And so the agenda that starts to fall out of all of these chapters is we can't stop here. This is the end of the story. This is a staging post. This book's a sort of staging post for the next phase here of how do we integrate markets, governance and civil society more effectively. How can we see that as something that's going to be a bigger movement than alternative food networks in itself suggests, you know, which is a sort of marginal thing. How do we move it from the marginal to the mainstream? And how do we convince governments and politicians and so on to develop these things in ways which can develop? So there's some big challenges, and I think it's important to reflect on the agri-food scholarship that's happened, and to think through where that now goes. And what I think many of us here in this building working on these things would suggest is that place and space and where, the question of where and how become really important in this process. And we want to inform our theories with action and civil actions on the ground, and also inform them in policy. So this is a position statement. It's the beginning of the end. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to start off first of all by thanking Terry for both, you know, his immense knowledge and experience that helped drive this book, and also for giving me the opportunity to write something with him. I mean, I guess almost everybody in this room knows of Terry and his reputation, as Kevin alluded to earlier, and certainly for anybody to have his name associated with a co-edit a book in this case with Terry means that your name is recognised, you know, 100-fold, and it was just yourself. So, and again, as most of you are aware, it's almost impossible to follow Terry, his experience and the way he put across what we tried to do in this book. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes really trying to, I just want to get across one of the kind of core elements that we tried to get across in this book in terms of what a sustainable food paradigm could look like. And as most of you who, well, hopefully you've all bought a copy and you'll be reading and discovering all the details later, you'll see in the book, as Terry mentioned earlier, what we tried to do really was set out a series of what we see as building blocks that are the basis of a new sustainable food paradigm, rather than setting out in concrete what a sustainable food paradigm would be. But as what we have done in the book is suggest the kind of conceptual hurdles that we feel a new paradigm should we should have to overcome in order to reach this new paradigm. The issues, so I've got a series of 4 issues that need to be addressed, and these really can act as cardinal points in the assessment of our food system, how our future food systems compare to relate to these 4 points, and as a measure of sustainability. Unfortunately, I don't have a slide, so you're just going to have to bear with me talking. Second, I'll be brief. So the 4, again, conceptual hurdles that we set out in the first chapter of the book, which we address later on and then return to in the conclusions. The first one is this balance between reflexive and corporatist governance structures, rather. This again is something that, as all 4 of these hurdles are, something that we address throughout the book. So, as most people will be aware of, there's 2 sort of strands of governance that we research as researchers and the people interested in this thing. There's a growing area of reflexive governance. Prime example of this would be food strategies and food charters, food policy councils, which we pick up in chapter 2 and also specifically in the urban context in chapter 9. And there's a need to assess its use, demonstrate the need for a more reflexive governance system in the food system compared to a more traditional corporatist governance system, which relates very much to what Lee talks about and Terry obviously has written a lot about. So the dimensions of reflexive governance are very much about taking a holistic view to food, having participatory processes, an emphasis on research and development and gaining new forms of knowledge and integrating it into a collective governance of the food system, compared to a corporatist model, which is more about free flow of goods and capital, as you will be aware of. The second conceptual hurdle that needs to be addressed, and the cardinal point by which a food paradigm can be a sustainable food paradigm can be measured against, is a focus on property rights and regimes, and we very much, and this comes out in Alex and Zella's chapter in chapter 8 in the book. There's a need to we would suggest a need to reorientate property rights, current property rights and regimes. In the developing world, obviously, the most clear example of this is land grabbing, which you'll be aware of, and in the Western world particularly, there's a process of increasing closure of farmland, and also a struggle from alternative food networks, people behind alternative food networks and urban consumers to gain access to the land and productive capacity of land and ecosystem services and things that relate to it. So this is an ongoing struggle and something that a new food paradigm should address. The third element is we call for a recognition of spatial and social inequalities that are currently within the food system, bound up in the food system, and we would argue are getting worse. Again, it comes up in many of the chapters, the idea that for a truly sustainable system, whatever sustainable means, perhaps we can discuss later. But it seems clear and evident that a sustainable system is one that is equitable, in social terms and spatially equitable. So, and obviously the main manifestations of inequality at the moment, there's in the news a lot, would be food banks, but also the global poverty issues, recurrent global poverty issues, and the plight of small farmers, etc. So again, this is an issue that comes up in a few of the chapters. We suggest that procurement can be a tool, public procurement can be a tool to help we address these social inequalities. There are issues that come through again in a few of the chapters on empowering consumers to be able to make choices that help we address this balance. And also discussions about what the right type of consumption is, how should we measure inequality. And then the fourth element, which I'll briefly mention, and again is in the first chapter in much more detail, is to address the balance between what we viewed over recent years as being a movement towards short-termism in terms of development needs and the availability of funding both in research but also in the field, as it were. So there's a relationship between temporal measurements around food policy and social movements, etc., and how these relate to spatial output, spatial impacts rather, of projectification is something that we discuss, and that really relates to, again, and it's an issue that we talk about a lot, is relationship between effectiveness of policy and equality. What we find with the recent projectification, so the more and more pieces of funding initiatives focused on geographically discrete areas, is there's a risk, although these provide benefits in terms of learning and obviously benefits for the areas that they're focused on, the areas that don't have benefit from projects and research risk losing out, as it were. So there's a kind of a general balance. It's much more kind of really put. So I'd just like to, well, first of all, thank the co-authors, some of you are here today, for taking a very fruitful process that we went through. I think the book is a good read, and it's a good representation of all the work we've done at Brass over the years and Cardiff more generally. And it raises many questions more than it answers as normal. And I guess it's something that perhaps hopefully we can pick up in the question and answer section.
I think I'll just stand here. I welcome the opportunity to come here today because I think sometimes, as someone who represents farmers who are there, they're literally on the factory floor as they see it. Sometimes academics seem to be something that's up there in, sort of in the sky, in blue sky thinking, and there is a sort of feeling that they don't always understand what goes on my farm. And farmers are, by their nature, particularly in Wales, because I think it's something to do with livestock and mountains. You sort of you live in the valley, your neighbour is in the next valley, and you may never see them for weeks on end. But certainly, they tend to feel battened down by government policy and European policy, and the general public wanting access to the countryside, for example, or the general public wanting less fat on their food, or the general public, the perception that everyone hates farmers. As I was driving down the A470 today, I'm looking at a Wales which is valued for being beautiful. It is there, the beautiful scenery you see as you drive down is a product of farming. And although there are perceptions, sometimes real, sometimes not so real, that farmers are actually out there destroying the countryside, the reality is that if you ask a farmer, and I have, what do they think of sustainable food systems? Sustainability to them is they are the guardian of that farm. They don't own the land. They are looking after that land for the next generation, hopefully their children, and take it on. So fundamentally, farmers are sustainable, and they believe they are practicing sustainable farming methods and sustainable food production. In Wales, because of our geography and topography, which everyone loves in our climate, we are very reliant on livestock farming. Only 12% of Wales is actually down to arable production. And to be honest, apart from around the edges of Wales, the reality of growing arable on some of the mountain areas is just not, unless it's supported by agri-environment schemes, for example, it's not a reality. But what we are good at is producing livestock, sheep and beef. The work that has been done through food marketing initiatives and getting recognition, European recognition for Welsh lamb and Welsh beef has meant that we're actually exporters. We're obviously, you in Cardiff can't eat enough of our sheep and beef to make it worthwhile, just producing what you eat. So we are reliant on export. But farmers recognise that they are price takers. Whatever government or Europe throws at them, they have to react to what the market produces unless they get subsidised. The latest buzzwords, and you made reference to it earlier, the ecosystem service approach. You try asking a farmer what they see as an ecosystem service approach. I have asked several, and I know we've had this discussion in the past. What is it? If you as academics can't work out what it is, how do you expect Farmer Giles up on a mountain in Plynlimmon to know what it is as well? On paper, yes, it'll work, but you have to remember that currently, under European regulation, all funding for agri-environment schemes has to be paid on an income foregone plus transaction costs. Farmers don't do it to make a profit. They do it basically, they go into agri-environment schemes because of cash flow. So unless we can come up with a way of marketing the environment and actually putting a profit element into it, then you will always find that those farmers that can make more returns out to the market will farm livestock or small areas arable. But those guys up on top of the mountains, the real hard to farm areas, are the ones that will look more towards agri-environment. But if we really want an ecosystem service approach, we need to have a profit element. We need to be bringing in the private sector. The other thing I'll say about agri-environment, or potentially the ecosystem service approach, is that farming by its very nature is very long term. As farmers are price takers, what they cannot do is next week change their entire genetics to meet some market demand. They need security. They need to be able to plan their businesses over the long term. 10, 20 years minimum is the way that they see, from the time you've put in your breeding and your genetics, that you make that investment now for a future market that you're hoping will still be there down the line. And so whatever you as academics decide or see the benefits in, you've got to remember that the guys on the ground will have to adapt, because as I said, they're price takers. They can't help it. There's very few there are obvious successes where people have added value to their products, but basically it must be something about livestock farmers. They're not particularly good at cooperating for any great length of time and in any great numbers. We're absolutely great about in Wales for getting together in buying cooperatives and farmers cooperatives where they can buy feed and fertiliser, etc. But traditionally, they're not very good at large cooperative ventures. And the one time they did have a large cooperative venture, it was called the Milk Marketing Board, and it was deemed to be anti-competition, and so was had to be broken up. And I have to admit, working with farmers, it's a case of once bitten, twice shy. You had a successful model, they saw it, and now when government try and encourage farmers to work cooperatively, you'll get a small scale, but there is still that sort of rich memory within the industry of what happened long ago. As I said in opening, I welcome the opportunity to sort of address you, and I hope, having just spent the last couple of weeks writing my response to the Welsh Government's consultation on future, the Rural Development Plan in future, which actually encourages better linkages between the grassroots, the farmer, and the research institutions. I'd like to think today, and the launch of the book, as the first step in improving our sort of communication, so that we can go into the future, because farmers always have been technology takers. They are very good at adapting new technology and anything to make life easier for us. And if anyone can come up with something that will save me spending hours in a lambing shed on a cold winter's evening, I'd be first in the queue for it. But as I said, thank you for the opportunity to come to address you here today, and I'm open to any questions you might throw at me. Thank you.
We'll open the evening up now to questions and comments. And of course, since the book's been published, we've seen new trends in the food sector. And of course, two of the big agents that will shape the sustainability debate will be supermarkets and governments. And we know that recently, for example, supermarkets have declared that they're going to be investing millions and millions and millions of pounds in price wars. And we know that the biggest victim of a price war is the primary producer. So that retail revolution that's going on now, as the supermarkets vie for the market in an age of austerity, will ripple down the food chain, and it will impact private producers, the very people that Rian has just been mentioning. And that's on the production side. On the consumption side, and we're delighted to have Adrian here with us this evening from Public Health Wales and Cardiff and the Vale University Health Board, who's also been the chair of the Cardiff Food Policy Council recently. The role of public health. I can't remember a time when nutritional advice was in such chaos in terms of the scientific state of the art. When you think currently now of major scientists vying in the public eye over fat versus sugar. Fat has been demonized for 30 years, and now the jury's coming in, and it's less of a demon than sugar. And now the nutritional bandwagon is shifting the focus to sugar. All these things ripple down to what constitutes a healthy diet, and that in turn will ripple down to what farmers, producers and supermarkets will be framing. So those are just two big issues in terms of food politics, from retail, from production, right through to consumption and the role of public health. So, having got that off my chest, who's going to comment to address questions to our panel, or indeed comments further afield? Jane, can we kick off here? Can you introduce yourself, please?
Jane Forshaw, Director of Environment at the Cardiff Council. This is fascinating, and personally and professionally, I love it. Well done. I've got two questions, if I may, but a tiny bit of context. So I was married to a hill farmer in Wales, and that was fine. I loved it. I loved the farming. And so I was always terrified when we'd take produce out land and beef down to the market, and there'd be two guys who were the buyers for like 8 supermarkets, and they'd sit and have a coffee and agree the minimum price that we're both prepared to pay. So they'd rig the market before it even started. That used to really make me cross, and I'll come back to that. But then because my working life was at Birmingham, and being concerned about trying to reduce food miles when all the local Agenda 21 stuff was happening, set up the first UK farmers market. And we had a rule that food couldn't travel more than 50 miles. So it could have been an ostrich, which they did do, but as long as it only travelled 50 miles, that was how we got the farmers market working. And as a result of doing that work, which took off really well, and it's still thriving, I got asked to speak at the World Union of Wholesale Markets and spoke on the same platform as a man who developed a food dye that you could inject into strawberries to make them look red even when they were totally unripe, so that the supermarkets could sell them as nice red strawberries. And when it came to the question panel, I got asked what I thought of that man's work, and I was completely honest, and got booed. I was like, okay. So just these whole pressure, you've alluded to them, and I'm sure it's detailed in the book, but the two questions are, the supermarket, the power of the supermarket is globally terrifying. When you look at their sort of turnover, they're bigger than the GDP of quite a few large countries. So that monopoly they have, that control on the market, right down, as you said, to squeeze the producer, terrifies me. So a comment on that would be great. I'd be interested. But the other thought in this agenda is, if you chunk slightly even above this, is the price of carbon. And if we could have, as a society, because we need something, a proper cost of carbon in the way we do capitalist accounting, I'm interested, because of inputs like nitrogen and food miles, whether how you feel the true cost of carbon, if we had one, might be the salvation in this event.
So two questions then. What are we going to do about supermarket power, and what are we going to do about the price of carbon? Terry, you going to kick off?
Yeah, I'm just looking through it. 2 points. Responding to that. I mean, as academics, we are effectively the diarists, you know, Samuel Pepys of the food system. We just discuss, we narrate what's happening. We can't necessarily change everything that's going on, but at all. But 2 points I think that are relevant to this. One is that in the end of this book, particularly, I mean, the carbon thing is still needs to be articulated. The level of carbon absorption in the atmosphere is now bigger than it's been for thousands of years. So we're in a position where we're still not doing anything about it in terms of mitigation and adaptation. So we've got a major problem there. And that links back to the issue of what Adrian was talking about, which is, again, an academic term, reflexive governance. Well, what does that mean? Well, what it means partly is we need fora at whatever level it is, whether it's at local community level or interest groups like farmers or whatever, particularly farmers actually, or retail consortia or whatever, to reflect on lots of these things, how they can manage the different trade-offs. They can't necessarily deal with all of these things at once, and dealing with just one of them is not going to solve the problem. So food miles is probably a good example of it. What is the carbon footprint of food miles? And carbon itself is not the only problem. Clearly, it's as Kevin said, to do with nutrition and quality of food. But in order to deal with these issues, you have to have government policy which allows the space for people and experts to be reflective about this issue, and that's a challenge. It's, you know, that people come together. My example of this is what happened, seemed to have happened after the war, indeed before the war, but just after as well, when we had farmers' clubs and farmers' committees, agriculture committees. Okay, it was dominated by the need to produce at any cost. You might say, didn't take on all of these other complications. But we need better forms of deliberation to deal with these issues. You know, talking is a better way than warring on these issues, and it's a start. I'm not saying it's everything, but unless we interchange, I think we've got a real problem, and that's what we really mean by reflexive governance, opportunities for spaces to get involved.
Yeah, are you going to comment?
Yeah, I was just saying, well, we sit on a lot of carbon in Wales, you know, and on top of the mountains there's a lot of carbon soils, and potentially a carbon trading scheme is being sort of mooted but no serious work has been done on putting a value on carbon. But there's a huge opportunity there into the future as an ecosystem service for some of these guys who haven't, as you know, in your time on top of a hill, they're very restricted in actually what they can produce. But if they can help mitigate carbon trading down the line, huge opportunity. Totally agree with the supermarket. We need an ombudsman with teeth, and we also need the public, because one thing that was thrown up just after the horse was suddenly people started using their butchers. At the end of the day, the supermarkets, they are reliant on their public, and if you go into Morrison's in Aberystwyth, actually the proportion of sort of Welsh, because there's a lot of farmers come in and sort of question the supermarket on what's on their shelf, the proportion of Welsh stuff is higher than perhaps if you went into Tesco in Cardiff. It's.
Adrian?
Yeah, just on your point about supermarkets. As it's apparent for, I guess, everybody knows in this room, in essence, is a question of power, and the power is held by the supermarkets. And unfortunately, we're living in a time where governments are unwilling to regulate, or unwilling to exert the potential power that they have to influence markets. So then it's the only two other constituents left are consumers on the one hand and producers on the other hand. And producers are really going to have to work together in there are various ways of producers working together, whether it's sharing information or formal cooperatives or that kind of thing. But in its essence, you need to counterbalance the power of supermarkets with power of another constituent supply chain. And, I'm afraid we can't avoid that.
Any question?
Thank you. I think this is all fascinating, and my name's Diane Creek. I've done a lot of work over many years on food policy, consumer aspects of that, on various committees, boards and whatnot. So, points you've touched on about supermarkets, the way I see it, there's also the side about our own responsibility as consumers, and how consumers can try to negotiate to find their way through all of this. And I suppose throughout my career, it's got worse. It used to be not as complicated, food labelling didn't obscure things quite as much as it does now. But there's something about empowering ourselves as consumers to be able to make what governments want us to do, which is informed decisions. They also confuse things by international trade laws and all of the complicated regulations about it. Somehow we need to bridge that gap between the regulators, the producers, the consumers, to be able to make it more sustainable and more the sort of things you're talking about here. How we do it, I don't know, but it's certainly something we have to engage in. And supermarkets survive because we all shop in them. And there's an individual responsibility, and there's the bigger responsibility of the body corporate for consumers as well. So
that's more comment than a question, isn't it? Yeah.
All power to you, and you don't put that into the mix as well, because we're dancing around it and not getting to the number. Well, perhaps we as individuals, as consumers, do have a role in this as well. And whether we're buying our Welsh lamb for the weekend, or whether we're just buying the cheapest stuff in whatever supermarket it is.
Any comment on the
Just to comment on one thing. I mean, the horse feed scandal was interesting because, as I understand it, which is demonstrated in their surveys, that people have sustained this more local butchers and so on. So, and the supermarkets are, notwithstanding their price wars, saying they're going to stop or procure more Welsh or UK meat. So the question I sort of ponder with this is: are we on a trend towards more relocalisation more generally and shorter chains, and will that grow, and how will the retail sector deal with it? And I am going to answer that question, but I think the more pressure that consumers place as consumers as opposed to citizens is an important element. And the more that we get, and I know it's not, we always say we decry cooperation as never being very successful in the UK. But it's successful in other countries, I can tell you that. And it makes a difference in terms of bargaining and so on.
Emma Powell from Public Health Wales. We've talked quite a bit about the challenges associated with sustainable food systems, and we can probably keep going. Fiscal, climate, health problems, climate change, supermarkets, etc., etc. But in your concluding chapter, there's a little word there at the end, opportunities, and so I'm interested in what are the opportunities for, what are the key opportunities for developing a sustainable food system? What's possible? Give some hope here and where we should be really placing our energies.
So where are the cheeks of light?
Yeah, well, again, I have to say this is why international research is really important. I don't think we should get bogged down with what's going on in Westminster for a start. And what we see going around the world is a lot of very interesting innovations, and a form of innovation actually, in the food system at the production and consumption end and in governance in many respects. So we coined this phrase post-neoliberalism. Okay, again, don't worry about it, it's going beyond the world of the ideal of the fact that markets and trade will resolve everything. We've been going through a period since the 80s in Europe, in North America particularly, of trying to level out trade and level out agriculture and food within that in ways which just provide a surface around which trade and money can be made out of food, and not least we saw that in 2007-8 when money was being made in a speculative way, an historic way, out of food and commodities. And that is not the way that we're going to resolve many of these problems. And we're going to resolve them by getting back to a nuanced, place-based way of dealing with our food, realising that it all comes from somewhere. All food's local, just that we've manipulated, de-localise it, in a sense. So our faith, partly, naively as it might be, is to look a little bit further ahead and say, people are not going to accept that sort of paradigm of running food like we run the production of a glass. Produce that glass, produce it anywhere. And you can use it, you can sell it anywhere. You cannot do that with food. You cannot produce food by the use of an app. It won't work. So I think we have to have a new form of governance around appreciating food for what we've lost in many respects. Kevin's been one of the leaders in the UK, in the world actually, on bringing back food planning. But food planning was a contradiction in terms. But it's actually bringing back the state as a vehicle for rethinking how we intervene smartly, not in the old way, not in brutal way in many respects, but in a smart way to innovate in the food systems. So the state is crucial to that, I think.
Yeah, I just say it's also bringing urban areas back to the country, re-engaging with where you come from. If anyone goes to Ireland, will see that the relationship, being a small population, I understand that, but the relationship between non-farmers with farming and where their food comes from is far closer, and I think we've lost that. And one of the reasons why the butcher section in supermarkets is so popular is that you can de-animalise your meat in a cellophane. It's something that's just there. It has no relationship with the animal it came from, and I think that's really important. Is bringing back those relationships.
Yeah. Well, just in terms of a more broader opportunity, I guess, for everybody, for researchers and activists and people interested in the food system, I think technology is an area that we should be focusing on more. So obviously food has an uneasy relationship with technology in terms of the industrial model of food production, GM and irradiated food and that kind of thing. But what we're experiencing now is a revolution. Well, there's a technological development obviously going on all the time, but also there's a revolution in terms of data, using technology to collect data within the food system, both in production, in supply chains, and also in consumers. And over the next 10, 15, 20 years, the potential for us as academics and for advocacy and for policy groups to harvest that information and use it in a way to really understand what's going on and put forward solutions, that potential is going to be massive. And I think there's a struggle that needs to take place with private sector, private companies that are going to be collecting this information. And if we can wrestle it into the public sphere, we can use it within opportunities both at the level of Cardiff and the region, nationally, globally. So it's good.
Rich?
My name is Richard Essex, I work in regeneration. I came here fairly depressed. I think it's got worse, and I'm glad we're not on the third floor. I just wondered if you could, one of you could give me a good news story about good change over the last 10 years and how we can build on that and improve circumstances. Oh, no.
I got one. Less salt, less house tax.
We've had fat and sugar, now you've got salt.
From a practical grassroots, we now have a process within agriculture called Farming Connect. Farming Connect is all about a one-stop shop for farming, and it provides them with the information, technology transfer. It tries to encourage group working, getting groups of farmers together to look at enterprises on farm which they might not have thought about, but because it's their neighbour and it's being used as the demonstration farm, they start looking at it. And certainly Farming Connect over the last 10 years and going on into the future has certainly helped to start focus farming and start to make those linkages between the research work that's being done. Not only, and as you were saying earlier, it's really important that we're not just looking as UK, but it's accessing work that's been done across the world. A lot of work being done now on climate change mitigation. There's a lot of work. The best way to sell climate change to a farmer is to actually come up with the pound and pence he can save while becoming more efficient. And that is starting to happen. And I think from that point of view, it's quite exciting. But as I said, it takes a long time for farmers to sort of start to adapt to change. Farming Connect is now seen as a trusted brand, and I think that is positive because that builds on in the future, other direction with
Great. Farmers one, academia nil.
Actually, there are many good examples in the book. If I can just give one. 10 years ago, low cost could masquerade as best value in public procurement.
Yeah, I agree.
Right? There was no debate in it. Lowest cost tenders won the contract. In the NHS 10 years ago, food procurement was answerable to the head of buildings and estates. In other words, food was an industrial commodity. Now, food procurement is responsible to the chief nursing officer. These are all small but important shifts in the climate in which Terry and the others were talking about the way in which food is viewed and valued. Now, have we got there? No. But these are, I think, Richard, seriously, I think these are important chinks of light.
Yeah, I mean, what Jane said about the first farmers market, I mean, they're all middle class and it's all expensive, but it is a move in the right direction. There are small steps. It's how you can make those steps bigger and faster.
But public procurement deals with society's most vulnerable people, pupils, patients, prisoners.
Yeah, the book is spattered with examples. Another great set of examples is, Errol's responsible for Cardiff Food Council, but Food Council model that's being used in Toronto and other cities, I think is, again, it's an organisational innovation which has made a difference. And it's made a difference not just in terms of a niche, it's actually making a difference in terms of the way people are thinking. And that's stimulated, in the Toronto case, in Ontario more generally, proliferation of small businesses and community enterprises. So I think at the community enterprise level, there's a lot of things. The danger is, and again, it's this temporal dimension. We shouldn't forget this, that, how can we sustain these sorts of initiatives such that they scale out as well as up? And, by definition, they're using a different economic model to economies of scale. That's the other problem we face here. You're not dealing with an economic theory which benefits big volume economies of scale. You're dealing with niche markets which deal with flex spec and create a range of different possibilities around provenance. So, the battle is on there about economic futures, about what is economically more beneficial in that sense. And it's never going to compete with the block market, the volume market. So you're dealing with a different set of issues. So food councils, I think, have played a very important role of giving status to those sorts of initiatives. And you're working on them now.
Yeah. So I probably share your your outlook on the situation. I mean, obviously, as the other two speakers said, there's been a we made. If you look in the academic world, the progress in understanding the problems has increased enormously these past 10 or 15 years. How much of that actually translates into practice? There's another issue.
I feel a lot better, but I just don't like taking the reading from Kevin Morgan. Really.
Sorry, please.
Well, I'd like to build on the point that the gentleman just raised. There's also some incredible stuff happening at the grassroots level in terms of what's going on in communities. You've got things like Feeding the 5,000, looking at food waste, the cleaning networks, and even what's being developed in individual towns and cities, people coming together themselves and going, we've got a problem, how are we going to look at this? And leading on from that, my question is, I was just wondering if there are any plans to take any of the information from this book to groups like that. Because certainly, some of these chapters here, and as the ladies mentioned, the opportunities, I think people would find that really interesting. But maybe this format, no offence meant, is not necessarily how they would engage.
Good question. So what are the kind of knowledge transfer issues from the book? Ted, any?
Well, I mean, that's a good point. We don't really thought that through. I mean, I think the point is that all of the chapters have been written by people who are engaging with bodies and stakeholders. I mean, one example, one of the things that a lot of us were involved in when writing this book was and we've been following it for 15 years or so, is the development of an agri-food strategy in Wales. And clearly, I think Wales is a partial success. It started to, and it now still has an agri-food strategy and delivery plan. It's more than we have in the UK. Agri-food has been put on the agenda significantly, and there's still a lot more to do. But a lot of us have been working on that agenda for quite a long time, and it's not easy to get these things progressed, but you have to keep working at it, and we will continue to do that. We've got an inquiry completing now in the Assembly on sustainable land management, where we're trying to get a consensus and an agreed definition, which I think we're making some progress on, between farmers' unions and the politicians and also the environmental bodies. And one of the things we've discovered from that is that it's a lot easier to break things up than it is to keep building them. It takes a lot longer to build the sustainable world we want, and you get kickbacks occasionally when things go back. So there's a danger that if you don't watch it, the old debates between the environment and agriculture re-emerge, which we were fighting in the 80s, you know. And so you need progressive politicians and people who can take these things further forward. And that obviously takes time and leadership in that process. We can only provide one ingredient.
And I would also add, we'd also involve Cardiff Food Council, with some of us involved with Bristol Food Policy Council. So that is in a sense an example of where the academy is involved with society and with government policy. I hope, anyway.
I just think that, sorry, yeah, no, it is, you need to work together. And, you know, the one thing about an agri-food strategy is it takes farmers as a primary producer all the way through to, you know, sort of the final consumer. But where there is still huge opportunities, and perhaps, you know, there's a green paper on access due out, which is currently sort of in John Griffiths' DAM, which covers allotments and growing, you know, sort of on a small scale growing around urban areas. Now, if we chuck onto a wider, more contentious green paper, and perhaps that should be as part of the sort of action plan for food and farming. And I think sometimes, you know, although we're getting there, there's still plenty of opportunities for joined up thinking across the board, because, you know, the small scale grow your own movement is something that should be part of, you know, the wider agenda.
A couple more questions, please.
Just a couple of points. Pamela Mason, I'm a nutritionist. Being fairly new to the wider food world as opposed to nutrition, I would just like to reiterate also that I see the City Food Policy Councils as being potentially a very good news story in terms of opportunities for the future. A point about nutrition, I'd just like to come back to Kevin, the point you made about nutrition information now being in disarray. I mean, I know exactly what you mean. I think I would want to preface that by saying apparent disarray, because as I'm sure you appreciate, there's a lot of distortion in that debate, which is actually coming from vested interests. Sure. And it's being made more simplistic than it actually really is. I mean, I think from the evidence that certainly I read very regularly and intensively, I've not seen really much evidence at all that would guide me to think that, for example, the healthy eating plate guidelines should be altered at the moment. You might want to shift them for environmental reasons, but for public health, I've not seen any evidence that would make me want to shift those dietary guidelines at the moment. It may come in the future. I'm not saying, because, you know, debate and evidence, of course, is always open. But I think apparent disarray really is where the nutritional guideline debate, I think, is at the moment, and there's a lot of distortion and a lot of simplistic discussion.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of Joanna Blytheman, just a comment, who has said, you know, the only reliable nutritional advice that you should ever give a consumer, you'll never ever see it on a label, and that's avoid processed food.
Yeah, yes, I mean,
you'll never see it.
Yeah, I mean, saturated fat versus sugar debate. I mean, it's actually processed food we should be talking about.
I accept that. Yeah. Please.
Thanks for listening. I'm just interested in your talking about the production impact. In the past, there's been quite high production impact within outside the market, and we've kind of lost that tradition of working class people growing their own food. And that seems to me to be one of the areas where opportunities to use the kind of legacy food growing that's coming out of countries out in the first place. Also speak on the nutrition side of the argument and the exercise and fresh air. There's an opportunity there which I wonder whether the research in the urban strategies doesn't pick up any of that stuff, because there is a bit going on in the first area, not at any kind of scale.
I think one of the, clearly one of the things that we're learning is that the health and nutrition agenda is potentially extremely powerful, if not the most powerful, motor or driver here over the next 10 years. If I was to put my money on what the driver for the food system is going to be, I think it's going to be on nutrition and health, and indeed, included in that, is exercise and well-being. And that's, you know, one of the wider issues here that's picked up in Alex and Salif's chapter is, what are we using rural land for? Because that, you know, we might be becoming more and more cosmopolitan. More and more of us might be living in cities. But the implication of that is, what are we going to use rural land for? Because it's going to become in more and more demand. We want it for energy now. We want it for amenity. We want it for quality food. And this is going to mean that the whole agenda and management governance of rural spaces is going to come up to the fore, like never before. And again, around the health agenda, we're in discussions in the Institute with various organisations who are saying to us, how can we assess, environmental aid organisations, how can we assess the health benefits of our organisation? You know, so health and sustainability are going to be, public health and sustainability are going to be much more linked, whereas in the past I don't think they have been.
Is anybody making the links with the food policy and the actual policy agenda as well?
Yes, yes. Cardiff Food Council and food councils in England. You know, what Terry says is absolutely right. I mean, I think one of the unsung heroes of the local food movement in England have been with the primary care trusts. They funded a lot of the good work that was going on, you know, particularly in Sandwell, for example, and in fashionable but a very pioneering urban area, all funded by the PCT. Those PCTs have been abolished now, as you know, and their functions have been integrated with local government. And that'll be a challenge, it's an opportunity for local government to develop holistic strategies, as Terry was saying earlier. So that's an opportunity for the future, I think. But public health is going to be one of the big drivers. Jane?
If I wasn't hearing this, we are looking at a joint food summit that will address, putting together these strands, so
exactly.
Address eating, sustainability.
A food summit in Cardiff, organised by Cardiff Council, Public Health, Cardiff and the Bay.
For the autumn.
The autumn.
For the autumn, and that will essentially launch, I suppose, publicly launch Food Cardiff. We have some funding for a dedicated coordinator. We want to build on some of the existing fantastic work, but also go into some of those more tricky areas that we've discussed here, and look at the opportunities associated with public sector procurement, for example. Look at some of the opportunities we have to tackle issues around affordability and access in the city, and how we can prevent food poverty and people needing crisis food parcels.
Absolutely. So that's a good practical illustration of the point that you raised.
I mean, the other thing I think in theoretical terms here, which is interesting, is that, and Roberta and Jessica deal with it in the book, on cities being an agency for change here in terms of reviewing that process. And I think that's an interesting point, because a question that we might have is, again looking to the future, is to what extent cities and city regions are the main vehicle, question mark, discuss exam questions, are they the main vehicle for enrolling in sustainability compared to the nation state and these global arrangements, which on both counts are in many cases lacking the legitimacy. So I mean, the question is the city region the vehicle, a significant vehicle for delivering a lot of what we want?
On that note, and if in the absence of any other comments, we've discussed a lot about food this evening. We've got a veritable cornucopia being served. I've been watching it being served up as we've been discussing. So, I invite you to join us to try to enjoy some of this food, having discussed it. But before we do, can we show our appreciation in the traditional way?